So I will start off by introducing our two speakers. So I don't know if I've already said my name. My name's Debbie Hopkins, and I have the great pleasure of chairing this session. So our first speaker today is going to be Professor Susanna Becken. Susanna is a Professor of Sustainable Tourism at Griffith University in Australia and VC's Fellow at the School of Hospitality and Tourism Management at the University of Surrey in the UK. As well as this, Susanna is Principal Science Investment Advisor at the New Zealand Department for Conservation. So across these positions, Susanna's work includes scientific research, science communication and knowledge transfer, as well as practical implementation. So she's published very widely across a variety of themes, including today's. And so we're very lucky to have Susanna with us. We also have Professor James Falconbridge, who is Professor and Associate Dean of Lancaster University Management School. James is an economic geographer by training, and his research focuses on globalization and professional service firms, knowledge learning and innovation practices, and mobilities. And I imagine all of us have used James' work in some way when we have been talking about business travel, when we've been thinking about mobilities related to organizations and so on. So we're very fortunate to have both of these experts with us here today. So I'm going to pass now over to Susanna, if you would like to share your slides, and the floor is yours. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Debbie. And I should think good morning, everyone. Anyway, good evening. It doesn't matter. This is, in fact, funny because we're all so used now to, I mean, this is quite on the topic, and in some ways it's quite personal. Because I've been kind of stuck in New Zealand for over 2 years, and this is quite a shift from how we used to operate. And now we're here all together, and I'm complaining that it's close to midnight, but normally if I had flown all the way to the UK, it would be much worse, and we would have generated all that carbon, so I'm actually really grateful. So I'm trying to share slides. Let me see. Okay, that's great. And so it is actually in my role with the Department of Conservation in New Zealand that I did this research, because part of the New Zealand government mandate is that every department has to reduce carbon emissions. And just like universities that are increasingly looking at their carbon footprint, we realized that a big chunk of the so-called DOC, Department of Conservation, DOC's footprint is the staff air travel. And so when everything stopped, with COVID, I thought, okay, let's see how we do this transition and how staff cope and what kind of new practices develop. So I just share some of those findings. I won't go into too much detail, and maybe James will say some of this, but business travel is obviously, it's huge. It's, you know, we often think of tourists sitting on planes, but actually for the airlines, it's the biggest chunk of revenue. And also we all know that a business class seat produces much more carbon than economy class. So business travel and the kind of really sharp reduction due to COVID is a very interesting thing, both for the airlines sort of financial bottom line, but also for the climate. Many people combine business and leisure. And for everyone who's sort of involved in tourism research, you would know the term bleisure. And I think also personally, most people on this call probably are quite familiar with bleisure. Certainly academics are quite known for that. Now, when we did the work with my colleague who was the Chief Science Advisor at the Department of Conservation, we actually looked at the three sort of, I guess, legs of a stool, or a table, if you want, that sort of a organization needs to balance. So I was personally interested in the emission reduction, but we were also interested in staff well-being. And we had done a very big sort of staff survey. We do one annually anyway, we have to, but we did one in specific reference to the COVID lockdown and the productivity. And so we tried to question, if you reduce air travel, will this affect productivity? And in fact, it could go either way, positive or negative. And the same with well-being, it could be either positive or negative. And that's actually also what the research showed, because it depends on the person and how they shift. Now, I know Debbie is very familiar with New Zealand, but I did put a map because we're bigger than people think. You think we're so small down there, but it's 2,000 kilometers from north to south. It's quite an extensive air travel network. Headquarters in Wellington, but we have staff everywhere. So the Department of Conservation has 2,000 staff, and we all travel before COVID up and down the country. And so I'm looking at the imposed shift after the first New Zealand lockdown, when literally staff were not allowed to travel. In fact, all the flights stopped anyway. So we had to, from one day to another, pretty much change to an online environment to do business, to engage with other government agencies, and so on. So I interviewed 18 staff members right to top level and across different functions. And we also looked at emission data and well-being. But I will focus on the shift in practice, how we do meetings. Okay, so just for anyone other than me who's interested in air travel emissions, we actually produced a lot. Most of it domestic, as you can see in blue, and then a little bit of international, because we're a government agency, so we fly to some international meetings, but not too much. Trans-Tasman, that's over to Australia. And then you can see how it went down and how it went up a little bit again. And so obviously this has been a year now. We have gone up a little bit more again. Okay, I won't go too much into that detail, but I did use sort of social practice theory because I was quite interested in those three elements that typically contribute to a practice. So the meaning, what do face-to-face meetings mean, and flying somewhere as opposed to doing just what we do right now, an online meeting, the certain sort of competencies that are involved, and what kind of physical aspects. And so we asked people about that. And one key component was the upskilling, and just like before we started this meeting, Debbie checked whether we can all share the screen. And that is exactly the upskilling that all of us went through in the last 2 years, and part of this new practice. And so I won't go through this in too much detail, but essentially the 18 people we interviewed, and this will look very familiar to most people in this meeting, they could sort of rattle off the process of when you have to fly somewhere for business. You have to book, obviously, then you usually take a 5 o'clock taxi in the morning or something like that. You fly somewhere, you have your main meeting, and then you organize sort of coffee meetings around that, or meeting with colleagues. Most people sort of work late in the evening, do emails in the hotel, sort of might have some social meetings, and then fly home, usually quite late and are pretty tired and have to catch up with family. So that's sort of the okay. So that's sort of in a nutshell the practice that we all quite sort of accustomed to. And I just have one quote here to demonstrate why people would travel. So this colleague here, okay, lives in Christchurch. This is where I am too, incidentally. Have been working on projects that aren't here because we work across the country. I would fly up to meet with treaty partners. So that's with the Maori on projects that came up a lot, that these kinds of meetings you really have to do face to face. They're often quite political and delicate. It's quite important, having face to face, but also flying to Wellington for training and meeting and get together. And some people would say that there was a culture of flying. You jump on it like a bus. You would fly just for rather insignificant meetings. All right. Now, then we had to shift and learn a whole set of new skills. People had to get certain equipment that they didn't have. We all had to install Teams, and we learned to whiteboard, and basically from that emerged a whole set of new practices, including how to schedule your diary. And for example, people learned, because all of our diaries are open, you can put meetings in. And if you're not careful, so people learn to actually block time for themselves. I'm sure we all do it, because otherwise your diary is full back to back. And so little things like that, combining work-life balance better, walking the dog over lunch, having time for the kids after school, but also having issues with sore backs, too much sitting, sore eyes, and all of that. people also find that with this whole new online thing, you have to manage the conversation much more. You have to be on top. If you're leading the meeting, you have to be more organized. You have to, because you can't rely on body language and some of that intuition. Okay, so quite interesting. Here's two opposing quotes. So this one colleague here in the top who used to fly a lot and then had to change. He's a senior manager. So now he has to do team meetings. I just stack them all up when I'm doing from home. I get up early, get the kids out of the door, and then just do them all day. Really efficient, was really pleased with that change, much better. Where's this other person, also a senior manager? I find it really hard to sit in meetings for an hour and concentrate and focus on what's being said. So that person, obviously quite a different personality, needs the body language, needs to see people. There's so much information in a direct conversation. So when you ask people, okay, is it, how do you feel about productivity, your well-being, how much in the future do you think we will do online meetings as opposed to more going back to the old habits? People had a bit of a mixed account, mind you, since I did the interviews, when we've been in lockdowns in and out, and nobody has gone back to the old patterns. I mean, yes, there has been a pickup, but I'd say we're back maybe to 30% of what we were before COVID in terms of just flying to Wellington or so for a meeting. People think this whole online business, it's much more efficient. It's quite an effective way of exchanging certain types of information. Several people mentioned it's more equitable because everyone can speak. And if people are introvert, they can use the chat function. And of course, being the Department of Conservation, many people actually mentioned it's much more consistent with our mission of protecting the environment. Negatively, okay, harder to engage, draining and so on, and feeling a bit disconnected, which for some people actually did affect the well-being. All right, so maybe, so this is my last slide, because we're talking about shifting baselines. People basically said, it's probably not socially acceptable now anymore to travel like we did before COVID. Before it was quite normal, basically, to have everyone at a meeting, you would expect they attend, but now you can't do that anymore. And what they said, and if you have a group meeting and basically the moment one person can't come, you may as well do the whole thing online. Because you then, it's sort of the norm has really, and you can't expect it anymore. And several people commented that it really has shifted or raised the bar for expecting people to come. So going forward, a mixed model. I'd be curious later in the discussion, maybe in New Zealand it's a bit different, but I would think that the practice to having business meetings in person has changed to only certain types of meetings that are significant or maybe sort of delicate in some way, otherwise it's online. So with that, I leave it, Debbie, and then we can come back in the discussion to certain aspects. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks so much, Susanna. Absolutely fascinating to hear what's happening and what has been happening in New Zealand. So thank you very much for that. So we will hold questions and thoughts around that and pass immediately on to James. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will just share my slides, which hopefully you can now see. So good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or as we now do in these things, whatever time of day it is in the world where you are. So I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Susan's introduced there. But I'm going to respond to the question. I think that this event was organised around the question about a new normal in business travel. I'm going to start by asking if we actually really understood the old normal, i.e. if we really understood what business travel was and what was creating demand for business travel before COVID. And then think about how if we kind of open up that question a little bit, we might start to get some more insights about what might happen in the future. Because of course, $1 million question at the moment, as Susan was alluding to, is what's going to happen with business travel when restrictions end, as apparently they do in the UK today when the world opens up again. Are we all going to go back to what we did before? Are we going to see aggregate levels of flying return to what they were pre-COVID? And it is the million-dollar question, and you can answer it in many ways. But my attempt to answer that question is to say, well, let's think a little bit more carefully about what business travel was before COVID and what that might tell us about what it might be in the future. So in this presentation, I'm going to draw on some insights for some research that I've been doing with colleagues at Aalborg University as part of a project called Airport City Futures, which was a project that was completed before COVID. And so is an interesting time to reflect on what we found before COVID and how some of the questions we're asking about the future then may or may not be relevant today. So just to say a little bit more about that project, because it helps contextualize what I'm going to say. So the project was asking questions about the future of what was called the airport city. So this was the idea that airports are in cities, but of course airports are almost like cities themselves, given the scale of them, given the kinds of facilities, and thinking what the future of that relationship might look like. As part of this research, I was doing one element of the research, and we were looking at the practices of business travel and how that generated the aggregate levels of demand for travel or mobility that we see. So what do people actually do when they travel? Why do they travel? And how does that help us to understand the role of the airport in business travel? And that helps us then to think about the future. And as part of this work, there was a future scenario exercise done, which, as everybody that did future scenarios just before COVID kind of now looks back and thinks, well, if only we'd have known what we know now. But what I'm going to do is extract one part of that story and connect it to some work that I did alongside this project around the question of demand. So demand is actually a large research center, but the question is what creates demand? So why is there a need or a demand to travel? What's the underlying reason for travel? And in many ways, we think we know the answer to this for business travel. It's a meeting, isn't it? As the kind of image on the slide tells us, and we always automatically think about business travel being about meetings. And of course, much of it is about meetings. But what we discovered as part of the Airport City Futures project is that there's a little bit more complexity to it than that. And we actually need to understand that. And Susan touched upon this right at the end of her talk when she talked about certain meetings and certain kinds of travel. Because thinking about the future requires us to kind of think about multiple futures. So I'm going to make kind of three arguments or ask us to consider three things as we think about what a new normal might be look like post-COVID. So first, I'm going to kind of ask us to think a little bit about how business travel actually involves multiple work practices. And so there will therefore be multiple futures. So there is no single answer to this question. We actually need to think about multiple ways that travel will evolve and kind of be reproduced in the future. And I'll illustrate why that is in a moment. And the second thing I want to suggest is that what I call the Great COVID Teams or Zoom experiment, which we're all actively participating in now and have been for the last 2 years, is really important. But we need to be a little bit careful not to be technologically determinist, i.e. to assume that what technology can do is going to provide us with the answer to what the future will be. I want to argue that we need to consider that, but think about it alongside other factors. And in particular, and again, Susan's presentation alluded to some of this, we need to think thirdly about the organizational decisions that are going to be made over the next 6, 12, 18 months and how they'll really matter for what the future looks like, as well as what technology can do. And so it's kind of thinking about the interactions between the two that matters. So to illustrate why I think these three kind of considerations are important, I'm going to draw on some work we did as part of the Airport City Futures project, where we worked with 3 major multinationals to look at why their employees were traveling. And for today, we interviewed as well, but for today, I'm going to just draw on a survey of over 2,000 employees at these multinationals that we did to understand why they were traveling and to try and explain why I think these 3 considerations are important. So to start with then, this idea that there'll be multiple futures because there are multiple work practices. So a very simple question we started with in the survey was to ask people why they traveled. And it's a very common question, but we disaggregated that in a variety of ways. And the chart on the screen provides a kind of high level summary of the responses. So we disaggregated it by travel for internal meetings, so within the multinational organization, travel for external meetings, so with clients or suppliers, so out to meet somebody outside of the organization. In-person tasks where actually it was not a meeting at all, it was actually to do something. Could be operate a piece of machinery, could be service a machinery, could be inspect something. And then hybrid is where people are traveling for multiple reasons. And again, Susan alluded to this, where often business purposes and leisure purposes can coexist, but of course, internal and external, internal and hybrid, etc., etc. So straight away, what we start to see is that, yes, meetings matter, but actually 14% of travel for this group, at least, was nothing to do with a meeting at all. So sometimes this would have been operating, some of the companies we looked at had machinery, so it would be to go and operate or fix a piece of machinery. For some of them, it was to go and inspect suppliers to make sure they're adhering to standards and protocols, and a whole variety of different activities that didn't actually involve sitting down in a meeting room at all. Now, why that matters is because we then asked those people as well, and of course this is pre-COVID, remember, what they thought was going to happen in the future. And I'm not sure, this probably isn't super clear on the slides, but what I'll just highlight is, as you can probably predict, of course, we've got different responses in terms of how many people thought they were going to be traveling more or less in the future. So the far right-hand side highlighted at the moment are the in-person tasks, and perhaps not surprisingly, these were the people that least expected there to be decline in travel in the future. They couldn't see how they could operate the machinery, fix the machinery, inspect suppliers, etc., without actually traveling to them. And then as we move across external meetings, so clients, suppliers again, were less likely to decline in the view of these people. And it was actually the internal meeting, so the meeting with colleagues at another subsidiary, another part of the world, that was most likely to decline in the view of these people we surveyed. And then the hybrid was, as you would expect, somewhere between the two because of the way it mixes up these different purposes. So as a starting point, what that I think starts to tell us is that actually the demand for travel and why people travel is different depending on the kind of reasons for travel that we're looking at. So an in-person traveler has a very different reason to travel for an internal meeting traveler. And so the new normal, as Susan alluded to, is going to be slightly differentiated by how different types of travel get reproduced post-COVID. And this leads me kind of to the second kind of point about the role of the kind of COVID Team Zoom experiment, which clearly really does matter. What we also asked people was about what they thought the main factors were that would affect how travel developed in the future. And again, there's a lot on this chart, but I'll just draw attention first of all to this blue box towards the bottom, which is the percentage of people that thought that the use of virtual communications, ICT, so Zoom, Teams, etc., was the most important factor. So it's clearly very significant, and obviously a lot's happened since we did this survey, as Susan nicely outlined in terms of the change in practice and the kind of competencies people have developed. But what I would do is also highlight this box at the top, which was what we labeled changing work practices. So this was about where people thought actually changing the way you do your job mattered in terms of what would happen in the future for travel. And as we can see, that's as or very nearly as important as the role of ICT. So actually, and particularly for in-person tasks, actually how organizations configure their work, how they organize the completion of the tasks within the organization is really important, because there are certain constraints or opportunities that can be created by how work is designed and managed in organizations that will have changed during COVID. But now the question poses, what happens as we kind of move out of the kind of COVID period, travel opens back up again? So technology really does matter, but it's not the only factor. And this kind of leads me to my third point, which is to think about what organizations might do next. So what we also looked at was the extent to which people were making their own decisions about travel. So were people actually choosing to travel, or were they compelled to travel by somebody else or by simply the nature of their work? And again, lots of detail, but I'll just kind of highlight some key things that perhaps, again, unsurprisingly, those people completing in-person tasks, fixing machinery or whatever it might be, felt they had the least influence over whether they could travel or not travel. So basically 21% felt they had no influence at all, 19% felt they had very limited influence over their travel. As we move across, again, hybrid, as we perhaps expect, is kind of higher because of how it combines different types of activity. But of course, it was the internal and external travellers, for those going for meetings, that felt they had more influence, that there were decisions being made about whether to meet. And interestingly, perhaps not surprisingly, but not less important, meetings outside of the organisation were felt to be kind of less discretionary, having less influence. Now, this connects to what Susan says about how decisions are made moving forward about whether we should meet, how we should meet, and when that should happen. So it starts to tell us that there are decisions that organisations are going to need to make. And on the one hand, we can think about how actually organisations, managers may be able to either enable or compel people to not travel or to travel moving forward. Because as we all know, it sometimes can be quite difficult to turn down that invite to go and meet somebody, particularly if it's, for example, a client, or as academics, as we were just reflecting before we started this session, the conference comes along, you're invited to go and talk at the conference. What decision are you going to make? But there's a slightly another side to this as well. So this is about that perspective is thinking about how people might be enabled or compelled to travel or not to travel. My final slide, what we also did was we did some statistical analysis of the results, and it started to reveal some interesting patterns. Now, all of the numbers here aren't too important, so I'll just highlight some of them. So what the statistics basically do is, if the higher the positive number, the more likely you are to get that answer from a particular group. The lower the number, so when it's into the negative, that indicates that you're less likely to get that answer from a particular group. So what the red boxes highlight here is that people with no management position, so these are people that are not in a managerial role, are much more likely to feel they have no influence over their travel, and much less likely to think they've got self-determination. And managers, it's the opposite. And again, that's probably not surprising. So managers get to choose whether they're going to travel. If you're not a manager, you get told you're going to travel to do a particular thing. But what we found was particularly interesting was, in the bottom table, was that then when we looked at how often people traveled, those people that felt that they had no influence over their travel at all were much more likely actually to be very infrequent travelers. So they weren't traveling very often, but when they did travel, they didn't have any control over it. Whereas those who had a lot of control, who tend to be managers, were much more likely to travel regularly, and much more likely to feel that they're making a decision to do that. So we end up in a slightly odd situation of actually people sometimes choosing to travel even though they don't get compelled, and traveling a lot even though they often tell us they don't like traveling a lot. So where does this kind of all leave us? Well, it doesn't provide the magic question of will travel be 20% less or more, but I think it tells us that we will see a change, and Susan alluded to, I think most of us expect to see some kind of decline, but the aggregate level is going to hide quite a lot of complexity, with different patterns for different kinds of travel, and even different patterns within kind of the starting category of meetings. Not all meetings will change in the same way moving forward. So thinking about who travels, why they travel, who might travel less, what kinds of work practices will change more than others seems really important. And thinking about the role of technology in that and as a driver of that is crucial. But also thinking about what's going to happen in organizations as we move forward, what the new policies will look like, what the new prescriptions for workers will look like, and how that will shape things is also equally key. So there isn't a kind of a straight line between the technology and the outcome in terms of the future of travel. We need to think more about these interactions between different types of travel and different influences on whether people ultimately get back on that plane over the next year or so. And I will stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James. That was absolutely fascinating as well. I really enjoyed both of those talks. Goodness, I've typed down a million notes and extended my question list quite substantially. I'm going to give a wee synopsis, I guess, some thoughts that have come to me initially from both of your talks, and then I will start with a couple of questions and then open to the floor. But do start thinking about your questions for Susanna and James as we're continuing the conversation now. I mean, from Susanna's talk, I really enjoyed the thinking or sort of the initial comments around bleisure, and thinking about how we blur categories of travel. And it's something that I've been thinking about. I know lots of other people have been thinking about for a while, about what we do with these different categories, and what work they do, and potentially what they blind us from by focusing in particular on business in isolation from other forms of mobility. I thought the focus, the idea around kind of the domestic aviation and the graphs that showed that in Aotearoa were really interesting, because in Europe we see very similar patterns with a lot of short haul aviation, which technically, I mean, in Europe particularly, it might be able to be see a modal shift towards a train perhaps. But it was very interesting to see that in Aotearoa as well. But then also, I mean, finally, the discussion around Māori, around treaty negotiations and discussions, made me start to reflect on it's very easy to sometimes, and this actually links very closely to James's presentation about the types of meetings, the types of things you're discussing. There's often an assumption that we're dealing with apolitical topics, and that these things can automatically, of course, happen over the internet, over these types of platforms. But actually, that was a really good example of something that demands a different mode of communication, perhaps. But then from James's talk, I really found so interesting that idea that business travel and discourses of business travel have just been overwritten by these assumptions of sameness, of homogeneity. So thinking about, like, the business practices are meetings, that the transport modes are aviation, and that flexibility, that it's all self-determined. And these are things that we see reproduced through a lot of the ideas of where change might happen, that somehow everybody that does business travel does it in the same sort of way. And the idea of seniority and actually that flexibility to make your own decisions, but then also being the ones that are actually traveling the most, made me reflect on what we're seeing in the literature on academic mobility about seniority and success becoming synonymous with hypermobility, and how that then gets reproduced by junior scholars. So I thought we could, I mean, I really liked that James started by thinking about, what was normal before, and was there normality before? But I wondered if we could reflect. So there's been a few reports written recently, one earlier this month by the Rapid Transition Alliance, who it was titled something along the lines of the death of business travel. And they provided the sort of statistics that James was just talking about. I think they said something like 80% of business travel would be done away with kind of after the pandemic, that business travel was over. And I wondered if you could both reflect on those types of narratives that we're seeing more and more now as we're coming out of the pandemic, with this just assumption that we're going to get rid of all travel, 80+% of business travel. I wondered if you could each reflect on how you feel about those types of ideas.
Susan, do you want to go first?
Okay, why don't I start? Because I think I really enjoyed that, James, by the way, and your summary, Debbie, and it's so true. I mean, there's such a broad, there's so many facets of business travel. And I mean, even in the Department of Conservation, we have people who literally have to go somewhere to fix a track, or, there's lots of things that are like your in-person work. So it's probably the particular type of meetings that I've talked about. So that's interesting. And maybe that's also, Debbie, the 80% is exactly the kind of stuff that was part of my interviews. What's really interesting in the moment, I think, is because of COVID, there's very much a budget pressure. Every organization has tightened their belt. So we know, interestingly, the carbon reduction Trojan horse is actually a financial incentive that basically staff travel is to be minimized. And then, of course, comes in this change in practice to say, well, now you all know how to do it. You don't need to fly. So I think it's sort of almost converging factors that people have the skills. We've developed some new sort of habits, if you want. We need to save money and we need to save carbon. So in that sense, I would say that certain types of business travel will actually go down. I think the threshold has become much higher. That would be my take. Over to James.
Yeah, no, thanks. And yeah, so I mean, the death is, it's quite easy to write the death of business travel and then start the conversation, isn't it? So I think some of it will die, and I think that's to reflect what Susan said. I think there are some kinds of meetings, particularly that won't recur, and that people have found that, you know, we're probably questioning whether there was a need for them before, and certainly the last few years will have led them to conclude there isn't. You know, I think one example that we saw, we did do a little bit of interviewing and follow-up work in the early stages of COVID. But one of the examples was how, for example, within multinationals, training has continued. You know, we used to fly people around the world to go and do training, but actually, of course, a bit like universities and online teaching, we've discovered that, you know, a good proportion of it can be done online. So some of it will certainly die, but I guess perhaps to understand whether the 80% is an accurate prediction, we have to think about what the 20% is that isn't going to die, and is 20% the right number to kind of put on it. And I think there's a number of things there that you know, we're only just beginning to understand. So one of them is what I would kind of call the structural kind of forces that are at play here. So these are things that that kind of create structures that don't lead to decisions. They lead to situations that there is no decision to be taken. Because with travel, we do often work on the assumption, as you hinted at, Debbie, that people are choosing to travel, and that is certainly the case in some scenarios, but isn't in others. So I'll just give you one example again. You know, we're all as academics experiencing this. We're finding that many conferences are simply going back in person, and there is no option to participate remotely, because in terms of the infrastructure, it isn't there to facilitate hybrid operations, where, you know, and I think Susan mentioned this, as soon as one person can't participate in person, you know, with a meeting, it's easier to go online. Well, with a conference, there isn't that ability, and that relates to a second kind of sort of thing, which is about what people feel they've lost over the past few years. So whilst many people think they've gained many things, we also recognize that there are some things that doing them on a screen we have lost, and as communities that we have lost over the last couple of years that we need to recreate. And so there will be some things that people feel they need to go back to doing. And the question is, how do we understand where the threshold is between what we've lost and what we've gained, and how that will have an influence. So that's partly the conference story, that many people accept that whilst you can give a presentation like this, and you can even have a bit of a kind of talk before and afterwards, actually there's much more to that kind of coming together and being together kind of phenomena. And that's the same in organizations around how they maintain their values and how they develop communities of people that can work together. And so it's going to be an interaction between kind of some of these kind of structural things that will persist, the kind of more culture, social kinds of things. And that's what's going to determine whether it's 20% or 30% or 40%. And I don't think we're clear on that now. So yeah, I think we probably all agree there'll be less, but it's just a question of how much less. And I guess that's to Susan's point as well about was it leisure? I think you called it business travel and leisure travel together, which, you know, there's a long history of understanding that you know, there's actually a high proportion. It's not just academics that, you know, do tourism as well as travel at the same time. And part of the motivation for going to the meeting is because you get to go somewhere. You know, some of that will come back. You know, many of us have, whilst we've not perhaps missed all of it, we have missed that ability to go to new places. And so I think that it's I always struggle with predicting numbers for these reasons. And of course, it is very useful to predict numbers, but I think we have to understand that, you know, as I say, the high level hides much of this complexity, and that's what we need to watch over the next few months.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I wonder, you've touched on it a little bit there, James, about some of the sort of negative, potentially, I mean, if we want to use the word negative, implications of reduced business travel. And you've talked there about, you know, the other things that happen when we travel. Certainly some work that I've done over the last year or so with academics has shown exactly that. People saying, I can't wait to go back to conferences. I need to go back to conferences. I feel detached from, you know, when I was in New Zealand, we had the same thing where people were saying, I need to go and physically be with, you know, my community of scholars and however it might be. And I wonder if there are any other things either of you can think of that might be potentially unrecognized or things that we're not attending to that might be negative or less valuable dimensions of reduced business travel?
Susan, do you want to stick with the same order? Do you want to have a go first?
Okay, why not? So I might not answer or say something specifically to the last point of the question, but maybe the first half, Debbie, because we all want a lot. I mean, I actually really want to travel away from New Zealand now after so long and see my family in many things. But I think, and because maybe it was mentioned earlier, there's other macro drivers, and of course, climate change is one of the really big ones. And so, while we might want to go back to normal, or even if it's only 60% of normal, in the meantime, we have this sort of ceiling coming down the envelope of the carbon budget that and I always knew 20 years ago when I moved to New Zealand, I thought, well, I can't fly every year to Germany, so people need to, this has also become a normal before COVID, that you can literally jump on a plane, which maybe previous generations couldn't. You might only go once in a decade or so. And so I guess the question is, I think it's a matter of timing, reverting back to some of those patterns and desires and opportunities, and maybe other new realities kicking in. So again, I wouldn't want to make a prediction. I'm just saying it's not necessarily the only driver. There's pressures coming that might stop that.
Yeah, and I mean, that's absolutely right, isn't it? In the sense of, I think, there's a clear recognition of the carbon kind of reasons to not simply bounce back to where we were before. And you mentioned it as well, Susan, the kind of the economic kind of drivers of this. Every organization has seen how much its travel budget has effectively gone to zero for 2 years, and why would you want, for some organizations where the travel budget was millions of pounds or dollars, why would you want to bounce back to that straight away? So there are clear drivers there. I suppose that's when they then start to interact with what have we lost along the way. And I think I've always thought about travel. I've described it in the past as kind of part of a kind of ecological kind of relationship, and I use the term mobility to capture all different types of mobility. So that's, you could call this a form of mobility in the sense of we're kind of virtually moving to interact at this point. So Susan's virtually moved to interact with me, New Zealand and the UK at the same time. And I always thought of travel as kind of almost supporting more virtual forms of mobility through the relationships you build and then exploit virtually, and then probably need to recreate again at a certain moment in time in the future. And that's kind of, we stick with the academic conference analogy, that's kind of what we do at academic conferences almost in some ways, is you build relationships, you now work and use them over a year or 2 years to collaborate, and then you refresh them by meeting again at a conference in a year or two's time. And of course it's back to the famous, and this is true for any organizational setting, that dinner can be as important as the actual formal meeting because of the relationships you build. And I think we've even seen it much more parochially and locally within, for us as universities, but for any organization where people have been working at home. I think we've seen how we've relied on those relationships we built before COVID to get us through the last 2 years virtually. But we now all recognize that some of those relationships have become more tense, have become more fractured. We need to rebuild them. And actually thinking about how we get back to the office in a very more parochial local sense is becoming important to rebuild those relationships. And I think in multinational organizations, it's very much the same kind of story about thinking about how we're going to reproduce that without simply going back to doing everything in person and flying to do everything. So there's going to need to be thinking about what we've lost and how we recreate it in perhaps some slightly different ways. But this is where, again, I think this is back to my kind of question about structures, is where it becomes, I think, particularly challenging, because it wouldn't be easy, but it would provide a solution if organizations placed a clear limit on travel, financially, carbon-wise or otherwise, to force people to think a little bit about which travel they were going to do. Very few organizations have an appetite to do that because of the risk that they fear, both of either losing employees or potentially damaging the organization by preventing something that matters. So we're not seeing, I don't think yet, any signs of many organizations. Some will be doing that, but they're probably the minority rather than the majority. And that potentially does pose the risk of showing that when people have discretion, they'll probably take the decision to travel rather than not to travel. And I can see this very personally for myself in the sense of conferences. We're being encouraged to think about whether we need to travel, whether we could go on the train rather than fly. But at the end of the day, there's too much uncertainty around what I might lose, and all the conferences are in person. So it looks like I'm back on a plane again this summer. So how that will play out longer term, whether I'll go back once and realize how much of a waste of a time it is often, and I don't need to do as many and change my mind, I don't know, but this will reproduce itself millions of times around the world. And so unless we see some kind of direct attempt to actually kind of create some structures to deliberately reduce travel, we could see more bounce back than we expect, because as that data I showed, actually a lot of the very hypermobile people are people that have the discretion to make that decision for themselves rather than being compelled, and they may well make the decision to get back on the plane. So
brilliant, thank